All Rise is a podcast where you're the jury. We'll put Christianity and other worldviews in the courtroom as we address the claims for and objections against the Christian faith, all from a legal perspective. Our host is Abdu Murray, lawyer, author, former Muslim turned Christian, and speaker with Embrace the Truth. Abdu was named several times in Best Lawyers in America and Michigan Super Lawyer, and he will bring objections right from the very lips of atheists, agnostics, and various religions to see whether Christianity holds up to courtroom-level scrutiny.
All rise and welcome to another edition of Defense Rests. This is a podcast where we take a look at the claims for and the objections against the Christian faith from a legal perspective. That is to say that we take a look at what is the evidence and the arguments in favor of Christianity and subject those arguments and that evidence to the kinds of scrutiny that they would get in a trial situation. Looking at the rules of evidence, looking at the rules of trial procedure, the way judges think and the way they rule on objections, the way juries think and the way they are called upon, whether it's through jury instructions or just the way juries think to decide the cases that they decide. How do they look and see if a witness is credible or not? But we don't just subject Christianity to that kind of scrutiny. We subject the objections and the other non-Christian worldviews to that same level of scrutiny because we're in a search for truth. And ladies and gentlemen of the jury, a jury is about getting at the truth. It's not about having a predetermined look and say, I'm going to only admit in my mind certain kinds of evidence or certain kinds of conclusions. A good jury is a jury that is open to all the evidence and all the arguments. Now, I'm a Christian, and I wasn't always a Christian. I subjected the Christian faith to an unhealthy, maybe even an unfair level of scrutiny during my journey. But at some point, I began to see that I was being biased, and I needed to take a look at it from an objective standpoint. I didn't want to scrutinize it. I thought it was the kind of worldview that could take the scrutiny and was worth scrutinizing. And if it was true, it would come out on the other side as more probable than not, or even bearing the burden of being beyond reasonable doubt of being true. And I found that to be the case. And so this podcast is an effort to do the same thing, to take a look at the Christian claims and the non-Christian claims, put it to the kind of scrutiny that I put it to, and see what comes out the other side. Now, my guest for part 2 of this series I have with Greg Koukl my guest is Greg Koukl from Stand to Reason. Greg is not a lawyer himself, but he thinks like one. And in fact, in an offline discussion we had, he had spent some time in a pre-law program at Michigan State University, I think it was, where he did some studying in this area. And he would have made a fine lawyer because we are discussing today, during the course of our episode here with you, Tactics, his book Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions. It is an updated and expanded 10th anniversary edition. The first edition came out in 2009. It has 40% more content now with updated illustrations, some polished up prose to use Greg's own analysis of it, and some great stuff, including more tactics. Now, the reason why, folks, if you haven't heard the first part of the series we have with Greg, I urge you to go and look at the previous episode. We'll give it a listen so that you get the context of what we're talking about. The reason why I wanted to have Greg on the show and speak about tactics is this is the kind of book that is, in a Christian context, almost a play-by-play kind of a thing you would give to a new young lawyer on how to take depositions, how to interview witnesses, how to get at the truth during conversations. And that's the bulk of how lawyers come to the conclusions they come to, or how they prepare their cases to present to a jury, or even when they present the case to the jury through witnesses at the actual trial, is you use certain tactics, try to get at the truth, try to understand what the case actually is. A good, scrupulous lawyer doesn't just try to bend the truth to their story, but conforms their story to the truth and then presents it in the most compelling way possible. And this book, Tactics, is a good example of how to do this. I said it in the previous episode, but I think it's worth saying again, is that I've recommended this book, Greg's book, numerous times at open forums that I've been a part of, where people have asked me, how do I have a discussion with my agnostic friend, my atheist friend, my Muslim friend, my deist friend, whatever it might be? How do I have a conversation with somebody? Or even more importantly, people have asked me, how do I have a conversation with a friend of mine who knows so much more about X, whether it's science or literature or history, than I do? And they're running me in circles. Should I stop the conversation? What should I do? And I always say, go pick up Greg Koukl's book, Tactics, because it helps you to have meaningful conversations in a way that edifies you and the person you're talking with. So thanks for coming back, Greg, for the second installment.
Well, Abdu, I'm really glad to be back because the last one was too short.
They
There
always
was
are, aren't they?
yeah, there was so much more we could have said, and so I'm looking forward to getting back into it with you.
Absolutely. Well, I am too. And to set the context, I want to get right into it because there's so many tactics that you teach us how to employ in our
Mhm.
conversations.
Right.
I want to get right into it, but let me just, for the listeners, once again, just remind those who heard the last episode, and if you didn't, go back and do so. But if you're here listening for the first time, the context in which our discussion was the discovery process.
Right.
In any case, that's a civil case, you engage in the discovery in criminal cases too, but you engage in the discovery process, which is a time in which the parties in the lawsuit try to find out from each other, looking at documents, interviewing witnesses, and taking depositions, what the facts actually are, what the arguments of the other side actually are, how you can test those, you can prod, you can poke, you can see where the weaknesses are, where the strengths actually are, and then you formulate your strategy of the case all along the ways. But in order to get there, you have to use certain tactics. So a deposition is a setting where you sit down, one lawyer sits down across the table from a witness, and there's sometimes another lawyer on the other side who defends that deposition. And the lawyer presents documents, asks the witness about those documents, asks the witness what they saw, what they heard, what their conclusions are, how they came to those conclusions, tests the assumptions of those conclusions, especially if the witness is an expert, and tries to find out the truth. And tactics is a good way for us to actually get there. So I want to go right into it because one of your most well-known tactics is the Columbo tactic. So
Yes.
describe to us what the Columbo tactic is, why you called it that, and
Yeah.
then we'll put it in the context of a deposition.
Well, Columbo is a TV guy from about 4 decades ago, but I have not been in a country, where I have taught the tactics material, and there haven't been people who knew who Columbo was. Now, I know the younger generation isn't so hip to Columbo nowadays, but still a lot of them know who he is because he's so iconic. He's the guy who shows up at the crime scene, and he's a murdered detective, right? So
Mhm.
there's always a body there at the crime scene. He shows up in this rumpled trench coat and a stump of a cigar, and he's all disheveled and he's mumbling to himself and walking around scratching his head. And this guy doesn't look like he can think his way out of a wet paper bag, right? He's stupid, but he's stupid like a fox
Mhm.
because he has a plan. And at some point, he's going to pause and scratch his furrowed brow and say something like this. I don't know. There's something about this thing that bothers me, in his own way. As Peter Falk is the actor, and actually, I don't do a very good voice, but it's very convincing if I'm on a stage with my trench coat and a cigar, still of a cigar in my hand. But you get
Mhm.
the point. And so he asks, "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" And he asks a very simple question. And then well, you're very intelligent. Thank you. Hey, one more thing, and then he one more things him to death with question after question after question. Now, so the key to the Columbo tactic is that the Christian goes on the offensive in an inoffensive way. There's a really important part here.
Mhm.
In an inoffensive way with carefully selected questions that advance the conversation. Now, notice I'm not saying that wins your point. I mean, long term, you're looking for something like that. But we talked last time how we're just going to do some gardening, to use one metaphor. We're not going to do the harvesting. We're going to worry about gardening. And to mix the metaphors, we're going to try to put a stone in somebody's shoe. We're just going to try to get them thinking. So, what I like about Columbo is that Columbo seems harmless. People don't take him seriously because he doesn't come across overly aggressive. And so we're going to use a game plan that is the absolute safest way to engage anyone in a conversation about controversial issues. I'm just
Mhm.
saying that because I've looked at lots of ways and there's nothing comes close to the amount of safety you get using this approach. And it's a question asking approach and it has 3 steps to it. And the first step is part of what you've described, especially in the last episode, as part of the essential part of the discovery process. You want to figure out the lay of the land, what the witness knows, what actually took place. Okay. So label that in the game plan is I say the first step of the game plan is simply to gather information. Now, let me make a qualification here, Abdu,
Mhm.
because I want to drive home a point that gets missed.
Mhm.
That is, we are not thinking about the end game. We are not thinking about winning that person to Christ. Just like a sports team goes on the field to play the Super Bowl, they're not thinking about what's going to happen when the clock runs out. They're thinking about executing the play in front of them well. And if they do that, then they execute the next play and the next play. And if you keep executing plays well, the end takes care of itself. So I don't want Christians to worry about leading this person to Christ. I want them, when they start out, simply to get in an attitude of discovery. What's the lay of the land? In most cases, when we're talking to people, we have almost no idea about where that person is, what that person believes, why they believe it, what their convictions happen to be, what experiences, good or bad, they've had with Christians or the gospel. This is all really important information that we need to have in place for us to decide where to go next. You've
Mhm.
explained in your process of discovery that when you get this information, you might get information that you didn't know know was out there. Okay, well, that's valuable for you. You might get information that maybe shows a misunderstanding that somebody has, you or the person you're deposing. Now you know this is something that's got to be corrected. You may get information that reveals a weakness or a flaw in the other person's view. And I guarantee, as an attorney, you're making a mental note of that.
Mhm.
All the while, you are not making your case. You're not trying to make your point. That's the time for the trial. You're
Yeah.
just getting all the information on the table. Now, let me emphasize how important this is for a Christian in an engagement with a non believer, somebody who doesn't share their convictions. That is already a potentially hostile circumstance, which is why a lot of Christians don't want to do this. They said, I'm not going to get in a fight. I'm going to sit on the bench. I'm not going to do what really we need to do as followers of Christ, and that's proclaim the gospel in some sense. So, since they're frightened of this is why I want them to see that the approach I'm suggesting takes a lot of the angst out of it. First of all, we're not going to try to win this person to Christ. I know for some people this sounds like anathema, right? Think about Jesus in the Gospels. He didn't try to win everybody to Christ in the moment. He was doing a lot of what I call gardening, right? He is
Mhm.
plowing, he's tilling, he's watering, he's pulling weeds, he's annoying people, he's giving them the bad news without the good news many times. So the bad news sits there and does its work on the people before the good news can really seem good. So, this is what I'm suggesting that we think about out of the gate. We're just going to get the lay of the land. We're going to find out what a person believes, what they mean by what they say. And in fact, that's the opening question. Some form of the question, what do you mean by that? And
Mhm.
it can be all kinds of different ways that this can be used. And I describe different ways in the book. But this is particularly true. And you had asked me about some clarity on terms in the first broadcast about the
Mhm.
difference between strategy and tactics. And the clarity on terms applies in our conversations with other people. Now, here's the key that I think a lot of Christians don't understand. It is very easy for us to think that the person who's challenging us has got all the goods. They've got all the understanding on their side. They're convinced of their view for good reasons. Now, they are convinced of their view much of the time, but not for good reasons, as you know.
Mhm.
You've engaged enough to see this.
Mhm.
And so when you start asking for more clarity, and that's what we're here in the very first stage. We're getting the lay of the land. What do you mean by that? Okay, help me understand this. You say everything's relative. What do you mean by relative? What do you mean by everything? You know,
Mhm.
when you say you're an atheist, what kind of atheist are you? Are you a materialist atheist? Are you a moral relativist atheist? Are you a moral objectivist atheist? There's different ways to go with it, and so we don't know what their view is. Let them talk. Biggest thing. which is
Yeah.
why this is a safe thing for us because we're letting them talk. And every time they offer a statement with more ambiguity or some ambiguity, we're going to ask for more clarification. This
Yeah.
provides us with tremendous safety. This means that we aren't doing the preaching, they're doing the talking. They like that. There's no pressure on us. It gives us time to think about where we might go in the future, or maybe we realize, well, this isn't going anywhere. I personally don't think, Abdu, that every conversation is a divine appointment. Some are, some aren't. And as you probe a little bit with some questions without creating any trouble, just getting some more information, you're not bruising the fruit. You may realize this isn't good timing for this. And then simply let it go. Let the conversation die a natural death. But one thing you may find out, and this is what is so sweet about this approach. Christians, especially the aggressive ones, think, well, I want to move on and really, pound this guy and show him where he's wrong or whatever. You will be amazed at how much progress you can make just by asking a person to clarify his view. And I know you stood in front of a lot of college audiences, Abdu,
Mhm.
and I know you take questions, and I know that you've used this technique because people say things who that sound convincing because of ambiguities. And the minute they are requested
Mhm.
to clarify some aspect, no, wait, I'm a little confused about this. And so you mean what about this particular thing? Help me out here. And then they try to clarify it. They realize they haven't thought very carefully about their own view.
Yeah.
And that alone could be a stone in their shoe.
Well, it's interesting you say this because one of the first things that I think rookie lawyers do and make a mistake about is when they're taking a deposition, for example, they want to get at certain, they have their outline, they have their documents, and they sort of just stick to what's in front of them. And like, okay, I want to get through these questions. I want to get him to say this and this. And if he says this helps my case. If he doesn't say it, it hurts my case. And so what they try to do is they interrupt a witness in the middle of them saying something like, my goodness, we only have 7 hours to be sitting here or whatever it might be. And there are time limits sometimes in certain cases where depositions are what they are. But the reality is that the surest way to lose a deposition is to try to win one.
Yeah.
Because you're not letting the facts come out. You're just
Yeah.
interrupting the witness, and then they end up seeing where you're going, and they sort of start to play this chess game with you. And before you know it, 4 hours have gone by, and you haven't gotten to the heart of anything.
Right.
Whereas what a good lawyer will tell you is oftentimes just let them talk. And it's interesting because I remember there was one specific instance where I had an expert witness on the other side of a deposition. And, I had gotten informed first. I had my own expert witness in that field who told me, here's the terminology they're going to use. Here's the kind of thing that this is their assessment. I think here are the assumptions they've made.
Right.
And I said, okay, I'm going to ask them these questions. What do you
You
think?
did your homework, in other words.
Absolutely. You have to do that. You really do. Now, you can use questions even when you're cornered and you haven't done every last T crossed and I dotted, but it's a good idea to cross as many T's and as many I
Right.
dotted as you can.
Mhm.
Well, it was more of a sort of not play stupid, but I'm asking the guy to give me an entire, I think he was an appraiser, a professional appraiser of a certain kind of item or property.
Uh-huh.
And I didn't know much about it to begin with, but my expert had helped me out. And so I was asking him how he goes about his process to get him to basically tell me. I wanted to know how he came to his conclusions and what he meant by this phrase or this phrase. And
Right.
at some point, his lawyer objected and said, this is not a lesson for you. You're not supposed to get educated on this issue. I'm like, actually, that's exactly what this is. It's the exact time for me to get educated on what your witness thinks of these issues. So it's
Right.
exactly that time. So I'm going to keep asking my questions if you don't mind. Well, I knew what he was talking about. So at one point, though, I was seeing if what he was saying was going to allow me to ask the next question, which was going to be if all you said is true, wouldn't this also be true? But if he
Mhm.
didn't give me the information, I wasn't going to force that question into the
Right.
conversation because it would have
Sure.
been ham-handed and counterproductive. I
Right.
think that's the heart of what Columbo is about, is getting information so you know how to continue the conversation. Okay, one of the things that I heard that I thought was such a wonderful way to put it is that the biggest myth about communication is the belief that it has occurred.
Mhm.
Um, and the other thing that I thought about was oftentimes Christians and anybody, human beings, we listen to respond, but not to understand. And I
Mm.
think if we listen to understand and then informatively and winsomely respond, that's the heart of it.
Yeah, and this is so key to the first question, listening to understand. And I want to emphasize that this will take pressure off of Christians. Because
Mhm.
if you're listening to respond, it presumes that you think you know how to respond. So you have some information that you're going to employ in this circumstance. A lot of what I'm trying to do is encourage Christians who are not adept at this stuff. They're not philosophers or theologians or apologists. They have maybe a little bit here, a little bit there, and they're on the bench. And I want them to get into play by using the game plan, which at least initially doesn't require they know a lot of information. Now, I wanted to go back to something you said about your expert witness. And I said, so you were prepared. He said, you got to be prepared. And I want to clarify, I think you have to be prepared when you're dealing with a specialist like an expert witness. Okay.
Yeah,
But generally speaking, when you're getting into initial conversations, you don't know what you're dealing with. And general questions are part of the process of getting the lay of the land so
very
you
well
have an
said.
idea where to go. Now, if
Indeed.
you find out you're out of your depth with the expert witness, well, then you can ask your questions to get the information and say, okay, I want to think about that. Then you can go home and get prepared on that issue that was discussed there. And I have a whole section in the book on what I call getting out of the hot seat when you find that you're a kind of a newbie and you're out of your depth with regards to the content. Then you go back. Now you know what you have to follow up on. And I tell some very simple techniques in the conversation to allow you to get the information you need to from the person who knows a thing or two, and then how you can go back and resolve that. But in a certain sense, your first question is attempting to gather that critical information that you need to know. You're actually kind of doing your homework in the process of asking your initial questions. To give you an idea about how important this is, Abdu, of like
Mhm.
not jumping in for the kill, so to speak. I was sitting next to a guy on an airplane. His name was John. And, I can't remember, to be honest, how we got into a conversation of spiritual things. I was reading my Bible as we were taking off, kind of thing. And maybe you saw that. Maybe he asked me where I was going. But at some point, he told me, he says, well, I'm not a Christian and I don't know anybody who is. Okay, now I think is that a valuable piece of information? Yeah,
Mhm. Of
that's a
course.
whole okay, but that might be the cue for some people to jump. Oh, great. Well, let me tell you how you can become a Christian and why you need to become one. Okay, but I didn't do that. I listened as he continued to talk, and then he said, "I used to be a Christian, but I'm not anymore."
Mm.
Oh, is that important information?
Of course.
Yes. And then he said, well, actually, I used to be a preacher's kid. Huh? I said,
Wow.
John, how did you used to be a preacher's kid? Did your dad die? He said, no, no, my dad didn't die. Just my dad's no longer a preacher anymore. In fact, my dad's not even a Christian anymore.
Way
Um,
more information.
Wow, is that information? Holy smokes. I mean, do you think there's any baggage sitting here next to me on the airplane? Can you
Oh, yeah.
imagine if I had jumped into my simple gospel presentation and tried to move towards the close when I just had the first bit of information that he wasn't a believer? He would have said, yeah, been there, done that, and it hurt. But as it
Mhm.
turned out, because I simply listened and asked appropriate information gathering questions as he talked, I was able to get his whole story and it changed the whole dynamic of the conversation. And at one point he said, people like you, people like me, right? Moi? Yeah, like you Christians,
Mhm.
people like you would be really angry at what I have said so far, but you're not angry at me, and I appreciate that. Now,
Mm.
let me ask you, do you think that just the fact that I was a polite Christian, not defensive, reasonably intelligent sounding, that is listening to this person express his woes in his experience with Christians, do you think that all by itself might have put a small stone in his shoe?
It's small, maybe even large, because I've had the exact same experience where someone has told me something similar to, I was expecting a lot more fire and brimstone
Uh-huh.
in response to what I just said. And if you just listen, oftentimes just the sheer fact of listening is so critical and
Right.
key. I won't give the details of this conversation, but I was sort of channeling my inner Greg when I was having this conversation with these people. It was a couple, and they said that they believed in God, but they didn't necessarily believe in Jesus. And why do I? And the woman said basically, why do I need Jesus and the cross? Can't I be good enough on my own? So I asked her some questions like, what do you mean good enough for what
Exactly.
exactly?
Excellent.
And we started talking about that. And it was interesting because over the course of asking some questions, without even making a statement, her husband looked at her and said, I once heard a pastor say that our relationship with our earthly father has a lot to do with our relationship with our heavenly father. And your father never told you he loved you unless you accomplished some major feat.
Oh,
And I simply used that and I said, well, wait a second, can I ask you a question? Is it possible that the reason you don't want to rely on what Jesus did for you and rely on yourself is that you've always felt you had to earn your earthly father's love and therefore
oh
you
my
deserve
goodness.
your heavenly father's love? Her words exactly, and I hate to say it this way, but this is what she said. Oh my God, that's it.
Oh, oh,
And then what was the beauty of it, Greg, was
yeah.
her husband said, "Wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. My dad was such a good provider, but he never hugged me, and he never told me he loved me.
Mm,
Maybe that's why I think of God as this impersonal being, like the New Agers or like the Hindus believe.
mhm.
Maybe that's why." And they
Yeah.
both became believers eventually.
Yeah, there's a temptation to think here, like guys like you and I, Abdu, we like to talk. It's like, wait a minute, you guys are going too far without my help. Let me jump in here. But of course, that's the beauty of this approach, and that's why I call it a safe approach. Because as you're probing graciously and genuinely, inquisitively about the circumstances of the other person, all kinds of things are going to happen. I never heard the story you just told, but I have similar ones myself. And I'm trying to convince my audience of Christians that even if you just stick with the very first opening move of the game plan, using questions, especially what do you mean by that, to gather information, you will be amazed at how the Holy Spirit will move in the lives of the people and make a difference. And I've seen it time and time again. Yours is just a classic illustration of that kind of thing.
Well, they eventually evangelizing themselves, and I got to watch it, and that's part of the it's part of being a
I
faithful
rest
to
my
the
case.
yes, indeed. Like, wow, I
Uh,
have no further questions, Your Honor.
yes, that's right.
Yep. Well, I want to go into the second step
Sure,
of Columbo because obviously the what do you mean and getting clarity is super important.
right.
But the next tactic or the next part, I should say, of this
Game
tactic
plan of the game plan,
is
right.
the game plan, right? Is it involves well, the third part involves some burden shifting and getting at the heart of why someone knows what they know. So go ahead and explain that
Yeah,
for us too.
and I suspect you addressed this in general in the past on your podcast, but I'll give it the short shrift because it's easy to understand. What happens frequently in conversations between Christians and non-Christians is the non-Christian makes a claim, there is no God, for example,
Hmm.
and then the Christian thinks it's his or her job to refute the challenge instead of first it being the challenger's job to defend it. Okay. So this is the issue of burden of proof. Who bears the burden of proof in any
Hmm.
situation? And the rule is the person who makes the claim bears the burden. Of course, we understand this in American jurisprudence, or maybe all jurisprudence, that the characteristically the burden of proof is on the accuser. So, if the attorney general or the local prosecuting attorney knocks on your door and says you robbed the bank, you get to say to them, "Prove it." It's not your
Right,
job to prove that you didn't. It's their job to prove that you did. And the way this works
right,
out in conversations, Abdu, is that we don't want to let the other person have a free ride. The minute we absorb the burden of proof for the claim that they've made, we've given them a free ride. And a lot of times, what others will do, and this is, by the way, completely understandable, they'll say, well, with regards to a concern or some issue at stake in the spiritual discussion, they might say, well, I could explain that. So, for example, we might point to the design features of the universe as evidence of a designer. You know, and there are lots of variations of this argument. I'm sure many of your listeners are aware of it. And somebody
mhm,
who's an atheist might say, well, I could explain that. And then there's this multiverse theory, and he might offer that. Okay. The temptation then, when they say, I can explain that, and then they give the alternative, is to try to disprove the alternative instead of, once we get clear on the details of the alternative, and that's where our first question comes in. Okay, help me understand. What do you mean by that? Spell it out for me. The temptation is for us to disprove it instead of asking this question:
Hmm.
how did you come to that conclusion?
Right.
Or why do you think that is a better explanation than the one that I've given you? Or something like that. These are model questions. There's lots of ways to use them. So
Hmm.
notice in the first step, we are kind of gathering information, particularly what their view happens to be, with some clarity. Then we're not challenging yet. Now we get a different kind of information. We are trying to figure out why it is that they believe what they just said they believed. What are the reasons for it? Now, I'll tell you a secret about this. Both questions, by the way, and
Hmm.
you're going to. I've frequently noted that when I ask people, what do you mean by that? Or how did you come to that conclusion? Or some variation of those questions, I get what I call, and here's a 60s alert, a warning. Okay. I, I'm an old guy, right? Uh, I get what I call the Simon and Garfunkel response. Remember those
Hmm.
guys who wrote this song back in
Oh yeah.
1966 called The Sounds of Silence? You ask
Hmm.
them what they mean by that or how they came to that conclusion, and you get dead air. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to
Right.
explain what they mean, and they don't know the reason. They can't say. It's amazing how often that happens because it's clear they have not thought through their view enough to speak it clearly, explain it clearly, or to give reasons for it. They have
Right.
absorbed the view from their culture. They have been socialized to say these things, and it's our job as Christians just to get them to clarify. And when they stand there mute, it's not our purpose or desire to embarrass them, even though it may be a little embarrassing. It's our desire to get more information and maybe show them that they don't have a view that's very clear or that they can defend. And that's another opportunity for a stone in the shoe. And notice, by the way, these first two steps, what am I doing? I'm relaxed. I'm
Hmm.
just listening. I'm not talking. I'm not preaching. I'm listening so I can ask more questions to get more clarification. And the other person is doing all the work. And that's exactly the way I like it. No fighting either. No
Yeah.
fighting, no arguments. Nobody's got their lines drawn in the sand, no defending turf. We're not fighting. That's great.
Right. Yeah, so it's funny because used to have an objection when I wasn't a Christian, and now that I get it, now that I am a Christian, it's oftentimes you have to resist the temptation to want to respond in a certain way. And I had a whole show on burdens of proof and some of the nuances, because in the legal sphere too, burdens of proof do shift in the middle of a case. The overall burden still exists, for example, for the prosecution to
Mhm.
prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Or in a civil case, if you're the plaintiff, it's your burden to prove beyond, preponderance of the evidence or whatever it might be.
Right.
But sometimes with affirmative defenses or other things, burdens do shift, but the ultimate burden still lays on the one making the claim,
Right.
because people do make claims in their
Yeah.
defense, and they have to prove that.
Sure.
But but the classic example that I have is when a Muslim, for example, or even an atheist, would say, "Well, the Bible's been changed. It's been changed over time, so many different times in so many different ways. It's been translated and retranslated that we can't trust it today."
Uh huh.
Well, the instinct the Christian has is to go into their, especially if they know their
Uh
stuff,
huh.
to launch into the bibliographical test and the archaeological
Sure.
evidence and all these various
It's good
things.
stuff too.
It is, and it's got its place. But oftentimes we can just sit back and say exactly what you said. What do you mean by changed? How does translation mean corruption?
Hmm.
And by the way, if it's been changed, when,
Yeah.
where,
Yeah.
who did it?
It's so funny. It's so funny you use this illustration because I was thinking of the same thing of our mutual friends, David Wood and Nabil Qureshi, who's not with us anymore. But
Mhm.
David was a principal in bringing Nabil, the Muslim, to Christ. And when Nabil said to him, and their opening shot across the bow of their 2 or 3 year conversation about this, and Nabil saw David reading the Bible. He said, that book's been corrupted. And according to David, the first thing he said was, "Go on. All right, tell me
Yeah.
more." And
Mhm.
then as he gave this standard objection of Muslims to the Bible, he said, "Okay, what parts were corrupted? When were they
Mhm.
corrupted? Is there any parts that are not corrupted?" These kinds of questions. And Nabil told me he said he was stopped in his tracks because nobody had ever asked them those clarification questions that are completely consistent with the game plan I'm describing. Now, David at the time didn't know the game plan. I mean, I hadn't even written the book, I think, when that happened,
Mhm.
but he was using the same technique, and it's an excellent example of what we're talking about.
Absolutely, and it goes back to that burden shifting, or actually burden placing. It's the right place, put it on the right
Yeah,
place, and it also gets, like you said, gets people to realize whether they have or have not actually thought through their view, or they're just parroting something somebody else said.
right.
And I've found this to be the case of various worldviews, whether it's atheists, whether it's Muslims, whether it's you name it. People will often just tell you what they've heard other people
Right.
say, and then when you ask them, "Well, how do you know that?"
Mhm.
Um, they're embarrassed to say, "Well, I heard someone say it,"
Yeah.
which, by the way, is also a wake-up call to us, to Christians as well, is don't just parrot what you hear people say.
Mhm.
If you make a claim, please make sure that you can back it up,
Mhm.
because if they ask you the question, "How do you know?" You better be able to answer
Yeah,
it.
these questions could be asked from the other side too. And I have a whole section in the book called Turnabout. That's one of the new chapters where I expand some paragraphs I wrote in the first book into a whole chapter because the tactic of using questions can be used against the Christian as well. And in fact, there's an atheist in Portland, Oregon, at University or at Portland State University, Peter Boghossian, who has written a
Mhm,
manual for creating atheists. I'm looking over my shoulder here. I think the yeah, a manual for creating I'm looking at my bookshelf here, a manual for creating atheists, and basically he uses the same approach I'm suggesting to upend the confidence that Christians have in their own convictions about the existence of God. It's amazing. It's like a tactics manual for atheists, but
mhm.
the same principles apply. And so we need to know. Look at if people. I don't think we should be afraid if people ask us, "What do you mean by that?" or "How did you come to that conclusion?" which are the first two steps of the game plan, because we ought to know what we mean by it. And we ought to know the reasons why we believe what we believe. And that's why if somebody ever asks me those questions, I say, "Hey, sit down, let's talk. I
Yeah,
got a lot to
yeah,
say." But there are other ways questions can be used in an abusive fashion that we need to guard against. But I'm just underscoring your point that we need to know the answers to our own view.
absolutely. So let me go on that real quick, because part of the role of a lawyer in a deposition is when you're defending a deposition, which means that you have your witness there. They have to answer the questions, but it's your job as a lawyer to make sure unfair questions aren't
Right.
asked, but also to guide your witness into the tactics another lawyer will use, and being careful, making sure you say, "Okay, I want you to say the truth. You don't have to volunteer 1,000 bits of information. Answer the question that's actually asked of you. Don't volunteer more than you have to, but understand that this is not the kind of person who wants to find out everything. Just sometimes they do want to get you in a gotcha, because part of a deposition is to lock in a witness so you can use their words
Right.
against them in trial.
Yeah.
But so one of the things I tell my witnesses, or I've told them in the past, is, look, a lawyer's going to ask you a question and answer his questions truthfully, honestly, and to the best of your knowledge. However, sometimes they'll ask you a question like this, and they'll ask you a series of yes or no questions, or fact-based questions like, "Well, what happened? What did you say? What did she say? What happened when this happened?" and all that. And then they're going to ask you a summarization question, and they're going to say, "So, Mr. Witness, is it fair to say?" And then they're going to summarize everything that you just said in a way that's more favorable to them than it
Right.
is to you.
Right.
Now, my caution to you is, answer it as you deem fit, except to say this: understand, he's not asking that in a way that's friendly to you. He's asking it in a way that's trying to trap you so that you will be forced to agree with him later at trial.
Hmm.
You can do is say, "How I would put it is," and then say it the way you would say it. Don't say, "Yes, that's fair,"
Hmm.
because then he's going to use that question in a way you didn't anticipate.
Right.
Say, "No, I would say it this
Yeah.
way." Now, the question I would have for you, though, Greg, is that that's in an adversarial situation. In this kind of conversational situation, we have a similar dynamic. But would it be fair for a Christian to use leading questions as part of the Columbo, but then try to ward them off when they're asked them as well?
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
Yes, I do think it is fair. Usually, leading questions in a legal context are not legitimate because you are suggesting to the witness what they are supposed to say, and you're going to get cut off with an objection there if that person's counselor is good.
okay under certain circumstances, but under other circumstances, it's not. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's not as strict here in our situation. And as long as
Right.
we're good hearted about it and really on our side trying to get to the truth of the matter, then I think that's legitimate. And there's a sense in which we can, and this is the third use of Columbo. And that is you use questions to gather information. Second step is use a question to reverse the burden of proof. Now, the third one, you're going to go in a little sense on the offensive and you're going to try to make a point, and you're going to make, maybe the point is that there's something wrong with their point of view, or that there's an error or a flaw or something like that, or maybe the point you're going to make is your own point of view, but you're going to try to use questions to do it. Now, there are lots of ways to do that. I describe in the book, but what you're asking about right now is what happens when they try to do that to us, I think, and
Right.
how do we protect ourselves from that? And here's a real important principle. There's three different ways I talk about in the book that people can illicitly use questions against you. But here's the principle overriding it that I want your listeners to hear. You
Hmm.
are in charge and in complete control of your own side of the conversation. Let me just say that again.
Right.
You are in charge and in complete control of your own side of the conversation. Now, that's not entirely true in a deposition case because you're under oath and there's other legal
Right.
considerations. You can't just say, I'm not going to answer that or whatever. But you can do that in a conversation. And when you
Hmm.
sense that a question is being asked you in an illicit fashion, then you have the right to pause and even to say, well, look, I'm going to have to think about that question before I answer it because there's a lot of things that may be involved in that. And that's all. You can beg off if you want. I want to give Christians the confidence to be able to say to the non Christian who is pressing them with what they might think is a manipulative, inappropriately leading question, to simply say, I'm just going to have to think about that, or I'm not going to answer that question right now because I think it's obscure, or however you want to say it. You can just say no, okay, in a polite way. But here are the
Right.
three kinds of questions you want to be aware of. One of them is a loaded question. I'm just going to call it a loaded question. And I talk about when I was on a national TV debate with Deepak Chopra, who's the leading
Sort of new ager.
new age guru in the world. And I had already talked about the gospel a little bit, and that issue came up. And what Deepak said to me is, he said, "You're saying that people who don't believe just like you are going to hell?" So there's a question. Now, what am I
Hmm.
going to say? Okay, if I answer his question straight out, and we do believe that Jesus is the only way, then I'm going to sound like a narrow minded, nasty person. And that's because of the way he put his question. Okay. So this is
Hmm.
a loaded question. Now, what I might have done, I took a different tack in this case. I parried the question. I said, look, I'm not talking about that right now. Right now, I'm making a different point. So he brought up the question to get off of a line of reasoning that I was pursuing that was not favorable to him. And right away, he's playing the rhetoric, he's playing the gamesmanship, he's trying to make me look bad before his audience. And so I just parried that. And like I said
Hmm.
earlier, we're in complete control of our side of the conversation. I said, that's not the point I'm making right now, Dr. Chopra. I'm making a different point. Notice I didn't deny it and I didn't agree with it. I just parried
Right.
it, okay, because it was
Yep.
a loaded question. I might have said, when you say believe just like you do, what do you mean by that particular phrase? Now, that would be the first step of the Columbo, clarifying, because he almost makes it sound like, if you don't believe everything just like I do, I'm right, you're wrong, and everything I believe, and you're going to hell, and I'm glad you're going there. That's
Right.
kind of what he's
Right.
trying to
Right.
do. Now, the
Yeah.
second type of a question is a kind of manipulative question. I'll just call it a manipulative question. And oftentimes these are what is known in logic as complex questions. That is, they're asked two questions at the same time, or maybe deal with two things. Somebody says to you, "Are you still beating your wife?" Well, that
Right.
assumes you're beating your wife, and then asks
Yeah.
you, "Are you still doing it?" Now you're stuck, okay? And
Yep.
this is the case where, oh, that's a trick question and an
Hmm.
abusive one. It's a and
We call it argumentative in court. We would say objection argumentative.
yes, argumentative or maybe unclear. Or, for example, when people say, "Who created God?" That is actually
Right.
a complex question because the question presumes God was created, which isn't our
Hmm.
view, and then asks us
Right.
who did that thing. Okay.
Right.
And a lot of Christians are stumped by that. Okay. So,
Yeah.
especially if they're arguing for the existence of God based on the existence of the universe, a cosmological kind of argument, they get hit with that. And really smart people ask that question. People who ought to know better. People have
Right.
PhDs in philosophy ask that kind of question. But that's where you
Right.
say, well, wait a minute, hold on. There's two things going on here, you know? So when
Mhm.
you, what are you, here's the question I would ask that person. What are you assuming when you ask that question? And a lot of
Mhm.
times they don't even know what they're assuming. But
Right.
notice how I'm stopping the process, I'm stopping the flow, and I'm asking for clarification. So the momentum doesn't keep going. That's what they're trying to create momentum against me. I'm pausing it. And by the way, this is all described in the book in the chapter Turnabout. Sometimes there are hypotheticals that well, what if this? If there were no hell, would you still be a Christian? An atheist
Right.
asked me that on the radio. Okay,
Mhm.
hypotheticals. These are like objection speculative, kind of thing. And what they're trying to point out is that you are just a Christian to avoid and escape hell. And
Yeah.
so that's not our view, but you're forced down that road against your will by the way the question is being asked. So
Right.
that's the second kind of question to be aware, to be careful of. The third one, very simply, is where statements are put in question form. Who are you to
Yeah.
say? Who are you to judge? Well, that's a question form, but it's really a statement. You,
Yeah.
you're not the person to judge. You don't get to say, is what they're really saying.
We have an objection in the law. I would say objection to the form of the question,
Yeah.
because it is not a question; it's a statement in the form of a question, and the lawyers are not allowed to testify.
Yes. Right. Okay. That's great. That's right. So, and what I always say there at that point, and this is all in the chapter, is I'm confused by your question because it doesn't sound like you're asking a question. It sounds like you're making a point. So, what is the point you're trying to make? Notice that's
Yeah.
another question back to them. And I'm controlling my contribution. I'm not going to answer that until they clear up for me what it is they're getting at. Now, if they put it in a statement form, well, no one gets to say, or no one knows the truth of that matter. Well, now I've got a claim that they've just
Right.
made that I can deal with because I'm going to ask them, well, why would you think nobody has the truth of that point? Notice how we just changed the dynamic. I got back in the driver's seat by parrying an unfair question and making a legitimate request. Why don't you put your statement in the form of a statement rather than hiding it behind a question mark?
Absolutely. That goes right back to once they make the statement, now it goes back to the part two, where it's putting the burden back on the person who makes the claim. Because oftentimes we can hide our burdens by not actually making claims, but making questions, but they really are claims.
Exactly right.
In the few minutes we have remaining, I do want to talk about some of the new stuff that's in the book. Let me go to one specifically.
Okay.
And there's so many good ones too. The power of so is sort of, we've alluded to it a little bit here. It's like you make a claim and like, okay, let me agree with you. And, that kind of thing.
Right.
But obviously, you mentioned in the first broadcast another one of the tactics, which is the inside out. But what I want to go to, and that one's valuable because that one speaks to, and if I could just briefly mention it, and then I want to ask you about one specifically because
Sure.
it pertains to a legal way to think about things. The inside out one often talks about the things we all know, the things we have in common. And what this goes to is a method of actually asking people questions and getting in a conversation that really gets to the heart of why people either avoid the issues or they object or whatever it might be. And it appeals to a common ground, as it
Mhm.
were, but it understands the person. It really takes stock of the person.
Right.
So when the Apostle Paul says to us to walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time,
Right.
Paul was Middle Eastern. He was anything but efficient in his conversations.
Mhm.
I know my people, and we are not efficient people when it comes to conversations. But what he means is, one, answer the questions they're actually asking, but two, find out the humanity of the person you're talking to
Mhm.
and what it is they have in common with you.
Mhm.
Uh, so there's this value in that, and they'll get that. It's not just a game plan book; it's actually a getting at people, getting to the heart of
Sure.
people book, and there's a personal element to it. But here's what I want to go, if we can, for the next few minutes. There is a tactic in tactics as part of the game plan where it is moving toward the
Oh,
objection.
yeah.
Open thing lawyers do all the time,
Huh.
and it is extremely important. It's one of the mini tactics you have in the book, in a whole chapter called Mini Tactics.
Uh-huh.
So describe what moving toward the objection is and why it's powerful.
Well, I actually got this from a movie, and it was, I think, Clear and Present Danger. Some might remember the movie. It's a Jack Ryan movie, basically, and yeah, Harrison Ford played that role, and he was giving counsel to the president. Okay, and apparently there had been a drug deal that had gone bad, and so there were dead people on a boat, and it turned out that these dead people were people that the president knew. And so everybody's telling him to distance himself from the circumstances. And Harrison Ford said, no, I think it's better to move towards it rather than against them. Okay. And he says, if they ask you, were you friends? He said, no, we were good friends. If they ask whether you're good friends, say, no, we were lifelong friends. And the point here is you give them no place to go, nothing to report, no story. That was a line from the movie. So basically, the way this works is that there are a lot of challenges that come up to Christianity that turns out to be things that instead of running from them or try to defend against them, we could embrace them and turn what appears to be an enemy into an ally in terms of the point that's being made. For example, people would say, and they're doing it now, COVID-19. How can you
Mhm.
reconcile this with your view of God, powerful and good, and all that other stuff? I said, and my response is, instead of running from it, is say, yes, this is exactly the kind of world you'd expect us to have if the Christian worldview is true. It would be a world filled with violence and with disease and
Right.
brokenness and evil. That's our story. Our whole
Mm.
story is about the problem of evil. It starts in chapter 3. It doesn't end until 66 books later when it gets resolved. Without the
Right.
problem of evil, we'd have no story. Now, notice how I moved towards the objection. I embraced it and I showed the virtue of the point they were making for how it played on our side. Okay.
Mhm.
And I think this is something a lot of people have never thought about doing, but we at Stand to Reason are making use of it more and more lately. People say the church is just filled with hypocrites. And I say, actually, the church is filled with worse people than that. It's filled with liars and swindlers and fornicators and adulterers and drunks and self-centered egotists and sinners of all sorts. This is exactly why they need to be in the church.
Mhm.
Okay. So notice I took a negative and I embraced it. I didn't run from it. There are ways to respond that church is filled with hypocrites. We talked about the power of so, and one way to say is, yep, it is. So what?
Yeah.
Okay, that
Yeah.
doesn't prove that God doesn't exist, Jesus wasn't Messiah, the Bible's not reliable, et cetera, et cetera. That's anthropology, it's not theology kind of thing.
Right.
But this is
Yeah.
just another angle on that. There's a way of embracing that thing and making a positive out of it. I remember many years ago, this is an example of this in a secular world where there was a Volvo or somebody had a vehicle that at 70 miles or 80 miles an hour ran a little rough. It just
Mhm.
wasn't a smooth riding vehicle. And so
Mhm.
when this came out, here's what they said. They said, listen, when you're going 80 miles an hour, you don't want to feel like you're going 30 miles an hour. That's
Mhm.
dangerous. You want to be
Yeah.
aware you're going fast and you have to take care and be careful of things. So what do? they they moved towards the objection, they embraced it, and they reinterpreted it in a way that was favorable to them. And that's the notion here about moving toward the objection as a new mini tactic in the book.
Well, it's full of other great new tactics, both mini and major, in the book as well. And we do that oftentimes in trials. A version of that is where you have a bad fact or you have something that's very challenging and very tough, and it seems like a bombshell against your case, but we call it diffusing the bomb, where you bring it up. You have your witness talk about it and then say, okay, this is the issue. And
Yeah,
this is exactly where I see their point. But here's the thing, if
yeah,
you understand it correctly,
yeah.
it factors in this way. So we do it in legal cases all the time as well.
Sure.
Well, Greg, time we have for our time together, I'm so thrilled to have spent this time with you. Friends, the book is Tactics, a Game Plan for Discussing Your Christian Convictions. It's updated and expanded. If you have the 2009 version, you will be benefited from getting the 10th anniversary edition that came out late last year. by Greg Koukl, Koukl. He's been my guest. I hope you've had as much fun as I have on this conversation, just listening in.
Absolutely.
I'm so glad to have been with you, and I know our listeners will be blessed, that a lot of pressure will be relieved. And I'm glad of one thing. We didn't give the store away in this book. We gave a lot away, but there's so much more in this book.
It really is. And people can get the book at our website, str.org. And we're a little slow on getting books out right now because we can only have one person in the office at a time because of the current restrictions, but Amazon gets it out pretty quickly. That's another place to go. And at our own website, str.org, our blog is there, STR's blog. My radio shows are there. We've got lots of things there because we are here for you. During this time, we are running full bore, no vacations right now. We're getting the job done because we know that so many Christians need us right now, and we're available. When you guys think about the book Tactics and you're considering it, I want you to think of the one word: safety. Safety. This book, this approach will give you more safety in engaging others than any other method available. That's my promise to you.
Amen. Well, thanks so much, Greg, for being on. This last thought is that sometimes, friends, when we think of tactics and we think of lawyers and trials, and we don't think about people, we think about cases and winning and presenting and arguing. The reality is that when the Apostle Paul says to let our speech be gracious, seasoned with salt, so we may know how to answer each person, we're not interested in answering questions. We're not interested in answering issues or controversies. We're interested in answering people who use their questions and use their issues and have their controversies in order to find the answers that they need. Questions don't need answers. People do, and tactics will be a resource that will help you to answer people through their questions and through your own questions to get people to think in a great way. My guest has been Greg Koukl. This is Abdu Murray with another episode of The Defense Rests. And friends, until next time, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense rests.
To find out more about our ministry or to donate, visit our website at embracethetruth.org. All Rise is a production of Embrace the Truth.